Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the latest episode of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm your host, as always, Barry, and today's podcast is really going to be focused on a slasher movie released in 1980 that I'm actually quite a fan of, and that is Terror Train. Now, admittedly, Terror Train, isn't as well known as the likes of Halloween or Friday the 13th, but certainly over the years, I feel Terror Train is a slasher movie that's actually gone on to attain a bit of a cult status. It certainly does have a fan base. I do actually think it's one of the best slasher movies of the era, one of the best slasher films from the golden age, which I think really kind of kicked off with Halloween in 1978 and kind of going into the mid-80s. Now, Terror Train is, admittedly, it's a movie that I was quite late in seeing. I remember this movie actually being mentioned in Scream, as many movies were, by Sidney Prescott, Neve Campbell's character, who actually mentions Terror Train, and I thought, I want to track this film down. I knew that it starred, obviously, Jamie Lee Curtis, who obviously, quickly became famous for Halloween and very quickly cemented herself as a scream queen. I found this film very hard to get hold of, in fact. This is actually way before it had a DVD release or anything like that. And I eventually, after a few months of searching, I was able to get hold of it on VHS. I paid a pretty penny for it, in fact, and I really liked it. I really like this film. I love the sense of claustrophobia in this movie. I really do like the setting. The whole train setting, to me, is what really makes it stand out from so many other slasher films from the era. Like Halloween, its emphasis is definitely more on suspense as opposed to gore. It doesn't have a huge body count, and there's actually, not a huge amount in the way of blood. But I just love the whole idea of this film. A killer going from, it's obviously set on a train, a fancy dress party, and the killer actually goes from costume to costume. I quite like that idea, that the killer is actually hidden from view from the audience. Like many other slasher films from around the time, it's essentially a revenge tale. These people are being bumped off one by one, presumably by somebody they actually pulled a prank on, and the person was institutionalized, and they're out to get revenge. Now, there is actually a bit of a twist near the end of this movie, and I quite liked it. I quite liked the reveal of the killer in this movie. We know who the killer is, but we don't actually know. This killer is in plain sight through quite a bit of the movie. So I thought it was quite a nice little reveal, even though I'm sure loads of people, probably see it coming. But yeah, this movie was directed by Roger Spottiswoode. His very first film that he actually directed. I think this is a film that he actually rarely ever talks about, doesn't particularly like talking about it. He went on to do, bigger things, bigger movies, etc. You've got to start somewhere. He went on to direct films like Turner and Hooch, Air America, Tomorrow Never Dies in 97, Pierce Brosnan's second Bond movie, The Sixth Day, the Arnie film, Stop or My Mum Will Shoot, quite possibly one of the worst comedies I've seen, and probably the worst film of Sylvester Stallone's career. But this was the first film. This was his first film that he directed. And of course, Jamie Lee Curtis was actually filming this movie back to back with Prom Night, which were both filmed in 1979 and obviously both released the following year in 1980. Jamie Lee Curtis is someone that very quickly rose to the top to become a horror icon. And it's notable for having David Copperfield in there. Now, David Copperfield, from what I understand, obviously, one of the world's most famous magicians, probably the most famous magician of all time, in fact. He had such a hard time with this movie. Apparently, he kept forgetting a lot of his lines, and he vowed to never make another movie again. And this is his one and only film role as someone other than himself. He's appeared in many TV shows and films since, but as himself, as David Copperfield. This is actually his one and only film role in playing someone that isn't actually him. And to have a veteran, a very established actor like Ben Johnson in this movie as well, who was actually approached by Roger Spottiswoode. They'd actually worked on a film before. I believe the film was called The Getaway. I believe it was released in, I think it was 72. So they'd actually worked together on a movie prior. So, you know, with Terror Train, it is essentially, I think, at its core, the whole idea for this movie was to be kind of Halloween on a train, which, to begin with, was thought to be kind of a ridiculous idea. And I think it was actually written down as Terrible Train. Basically, one of the people on the film had actually turned to his wife and said, "How about this for an idea?" "No, I think it sounds ridiculous." So he just wrote down Terrible Train, and it ended up becoming a movie as Terror Train, in fact. As I said, I really like the setting for this film. You know, the great sense of claustrophobia. It's a Canadian slasher film, as many slasher films were during this era. You know, they were generally cheaper to film there. And, you know, it was actually filmed on a real train that was actually rocked back and forth on a rig in order to, you know, simulate train locomotion to give it that real sense of authenticity. And there was a really kind of unique method of lighting the film as well. The entire train was mounted with individual dimmers and so forth. This film has a great sense of kind of lighting to it. You know, and all of the scenes as well had to be scheduled for nighttime shootings as well. And, you know, actual train cars that were actually converted for the production crew to allow space for, you know, large camera equipment, etc. There was a lack of room, and, you know, a special dolly was built for the cameras and so forth. So it was quite a challenge to actually film this movie, to actually, you know, give us the sense of this is a real moving train. Now, you know, Derek McKinnon's in this film as the killer, spoiler alert, as Kenny. Now, I saw an interview, read an interview, should I say, with Derek McKinnon quite some time back, a few years back, and I think Derek McKinnon does a great job in this movie. He's a very sympathetic killer, if you will. With what he goes through. He's clearly the nerd, a social outcast, if you will. And, you know, he has this horrible prank pulled on him, and he ends up getting institutionalized. You can't help but feel sorry for him. Even at the end of the movie, with this killer reveal, when he actually shares a kiss, he tells Laurie Strode's character, Jamie Lee Curtis' character, to actually kiss him. And it brings back memories, and he obviously has a panic attack. He goes crazy. You really can't help but feel for him. There's a sympathetic side to this character. He's not an all-out, you know, straight out-and-out evil villain like Michael Myers. You know, this is somebody that obviously went through something that traumatized him, and he's obviously looking to get revenge on the people that did this prank on him. Now, from what I understand, Derek McKinnon isn't really an actor. Even Roger Spottiswoode said this. I believe there was a lot of friction between the two, in fact. From what I can tell, Derek McKinnon had quite an ego. I think Spottiswoode had actually just described him. He's just a transvestite that we picked up off the streets. He was a professional kind of a drag actor, you know, transvestite. But he was cast, and it kind of it's kind of gone to his head a bit. Seeing the interview with McKinnon, he goes on and on about like that he was such a huge contribution to the film, and that he basically compared himself as well in one sentence to Robert Englund and Kane Hodder and Tony Todd, who are all horror icons. You know, he's no horror icon. Derek McKinnon is perfectly good in this film. Okay. Terror Train, in my opinion, is a good slasher film. I'm glad it has a fan base. You know, it's obviously a bit of a cult film now. But Derek McKinnon is no icon. And from what I understand, Roger Spottiswoode didn't particularly like him because of this kind of ego he brought to it. From what I can also tell, Derek McKinnon wasn't keen on Jamie Lee Curtis either. He's just... yeah, not to go into it too much off topic in that, but Derek McKinnon seems to think he's some kind of horror icon now. He really isn't. He really isn't. But he does a perfectly good job in the film, and even Roger Spottiswoode, had said this. Hart Bochner's in this film. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who's a complete dick in this movie? He's a complete dick. And he, of course, also starred in the slasher film many years later as Urban Legend's Final Cut. Spoiler alert, he's obviously the killer in that movie. Hart Bochner, from what I know, Derek McKinnon have actually said that his favourite scene in the movie was killing Hart Bochner because he irritated the hell out of him. He couldn't stand him. And it's one of the highlights of the film, actually, in my opinion, as the death scenes go. It's where Hart Bochner feels he's safe, he locks himself in the carriage, but then realises he may have actually locked himself in the carriage with the killer. And it's quite a suspenseful little moment, and he ends up losing his head, literally. But as I said, I really like the idea of this film, the killer going from costume to costume. It's not an idea that has been done very often. In fact, off the top of my head, I'm actually struggling to think of another slasher movie that has actually kind of adopted that idea. The killer Kenny starts off in, certainly without a doubt, the most iconic costume in the film. The Groucho Marx costume, which was used as the poster. I actually like the poster to this film as well. It's very simple. It's the Groucho Marx killer Kenny and holding a knife, but it's got a pretty cool little tagline with it as well. The boys and girls of Sigma Phi, some will live, some will die. I quite like that tagline. But the Groucho Marx mask has undeniably become the most well-known mask from the movie. I believe Kenny actually ditches it at around about 25 minutes, in fact, and actually uses, I believe, three or four other costumes in the movie, but the Groucho Marx one is certainly the most well-known. I did actually have a poster of Terror Train years back that unfortunately I let go, and I really regret doing that because it was a pretty awesome poster. Now, in this movie, getting at the film itself, it doesn't take very long for the killings to start. The killings in this film are, quite few and far between and so forth. But I wouldn't really say in this movie any of the deaths really kind of stand out as such. It's not like one of the Friday the 13th movies that, have notable kills. I mean, the first death, the characters actually believe it's a prank by this character, and again, quite a common staple of these slasher films from the era. There's usually kind of a Joker character, so they think he's pulling a prank in that, and obviously the killer. I quite like the shot of the killer taking his costume, actually taking each part of his costume, and then we get a head being smashed through the glass. Again, another pretty good moment, though. The killer actually takes his mask off, revealing himself to them. We, as the audience, don't actually get to see his face. And then, of course, he's lying there as, the person whose costume he's taken and then kills his next victim. I think generally speaking, the pacing is actually quite good in this film. And it ends up, of course, between the big kind of cat and mouse, like she did with Halloween. Jamie Lee Curtis is fighting for her life. She gets to kick some ass. She's pretty damn hard to kill. And I think in this movie, certainly, without a doubt, her screaming is every bit, if not more, prevalent than what it is in Halloween's. She certainly, in the last act of the movie, she really does get the screaming going. I think with Terror Train and that, it's, as I said, it's one of them slasher films that it does have a fan base, but it doesn't really get talked about a huge amount. As I said, this was kind of shot back to back with Prom Night. They both come out in the same year. Slasher movies were being, 81 the following year was probably the busiest year in the history of slasher movies. Terror Train was just kind of before that, as was Prom Night. But, with Terror Train as well, I think the kind of reveal at the end of the movie is quite a surprise. Obviously, David Copperfield's character, who was actually a suspect. Watching this film for the first time, there's an allude to magic near the end of the movie, that David Copperfield, his character, his name is actually escaping me at the moment, I think his name was Ken, may actually be the killer, but of course he ends up dead himself, in an off-screen kill. And that's the thing that this movie does, actually. Most of the kills are off-screen, which I've got no problem with. No problem whatsoever. Most of the kills you don't actually witness, in fact. And there is another death as well that completely kind of comes out of the blue. I'd love to know how this one's even been done, how it's done. Because it is quite a magic trick in itself. And speaking of which, David Copperfield actually found it very challenging, in fact, having to perform these magic tricks on film, which is basically like a big magnifying glass. People can look out for it, etc. And the cast and crew around him were basically witnessing the same thing that we were witnessing on the screen. But of course, one of the characters in the film is killed. They're stabbed in the chest. It's kind of an unexpected little moment, if you will. I don't quite know how it happened. I've seen this film probably around about 10 times at least. I don't know how the killer got to him without anyone noticing. But again, there's as we know, the killer's actually involved in magic. It's the magician's assistant. But yeah, it just kind of seems an almost implausible death. I don't quite know how that happened. But yeah, overall, I think Terror Train, it was released on Blu-ray. I believe it was last year or the year before. Pre-ordered it the moment it was available to pre-order. Bought it on Blu-ray, had it on DVD prior to that. And it really does come with some good extras too, as well. As I said, I think what really makes this film stand out is the setting. Is the train setting, and the whole fancy dress party, costume to costume in that. It's a film that isn't directed with the finesse of, say, Halloween, which I think is the creme de la creme of these movies. But I think it's certainly a slasher film that deserves a bit more attention. Yeah, it's one that I often return to, and I personally think it's the best slasher film of 1980. In 1980, we did have Prom Night, and we did actually have He Knows You're Alone. Prom Night, I will admit, there's people that probably hate me for saying this. I'm not Prom Night's biggest fan. I don't mind Prom Night, but it's not one of my favourite slasher movies by any means. I think Prom Night actually suffers from some pacing issues. I feel like it's a film. I like the whole idea of the movie. It certainly proved to be quite an influence, for college-based slasher films, if you will. But I'm not really its biggest fan. And He Knows You're Alone is another that I'm not really a big fan of. I don't mind it. I think it's an okay slasher film. I think, to be honest, it's most notable for being Tom Hanks's very first movie. Obviously, you got to start somewhere, one of Hollywood's biggest stars now. But Terror Train is actually my favourite slasher flick from that year. You could also include Maniac, directed by William Lustwig, which, again, I'm not really a huge fan of. I know that film was obviously met with a lot of controversy upon release for being misogynistic and all that blah blah, and starring Joe Spinell. But Terror Train to me is the best slasher movie of 1980, and one of my favourite slasher movies, as I said, from the golden age. So that's pretty much all I really wanted to talk about today. I just will quickly say, on a side note, there was talks years ago of this being remade. Which didn't happen, but originally the remake, it was going to be called Train, and what happened was it essentially took on life of its own. It ended up becoming a completely different film So there was actually the intention in remaking Terror Train, but it ended up becoming a different film called Train that was kind of essentially Hostel on a train, which I've only seen once. I don't really have too many memories of it. I do believe it starred Flora Birch. But yeah, that was originally going to be a Terror Train remake. So yeah, that's pretty much it for today, for today's podcast. That's all I really wanted to talk about. So for anyone that, well, I'm going to assume everyone that's listened has seen Terror Train. If not, yeah, I've actually divulged in a lot of spoilers there, haven't I? But yeah, good slasher flick. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks a lot, and I'll be back again soon. If you liked what you've heard, please feel free to like, subscribe, and yeah, take care.